Thomas Sigdestad with his beautiful presentation for our upcoming new version of Guillotine. Take it away.
All right. Thanks, Alan. Okay, so I'll go through some slides and talk about Guillotine 5, which is basically the new version of our Headless API. And if we look at Guillotine, some of you might not have been in touch with it. So what is it? Well, basically, it's from what you've seen, Tom Arnold now is working on the back end and dealing with the server-side code. This is kind of the version where you don't have to deal with server-side implementation at all. So it's basically generating a GraphQL API for your content types and your site. So that means it's strongly typed, kind of like TypeScript there. You get all the details in a very structured way. And you can also get quite a lot of it just as plain JSON if you don't want to deal with the detailed types. So you can add this custom library just to existing apps, or when you build new projects, you can add it easily to your app. And when you do that, you can also use it out of the box, or you can customize and even extend and integrate it in the way you want. So you could have custom authentication, add your own fields to and functions to the API, so to say. So it's highly customizable, but out of the box, it's very feature rich. So let's have a look what it looks like in practice. So here I've used our standard headless starter, and I've set up a site that comes with it, and I've added a few small things to it that you'll see later. But basically, this is the out-of-the-box headless movie database that you get when you're following the Headless, getting started with Headless guide. So you'll be able to set up this in a few minutes. And then you can see, clicking here, you get a link to the Drafts API. So I'll go here and I'll just open a new tab. And here we can see, we can browse the API, and we can try out running queries. So on the left, I have a GraphQL query. There's not much time to explain GraphQL queries in this presentation, but we'll try our best to show you a few examples at least. So you can see here we're going into Guillotine, and then we're running a query. And in this case, we're searching for Brad, and the type has to be a person. And then we're going to dive into the person data and print the display name and the date of birth and the link to his photo. So if you press play, we can see the result, right? So obviously this is most commonly used from web clients accessing the API, but it actually can also be used internally in XP if you like to. So lots of potential use cases. Okay, right, that said, we have the basics, we have some data, we have the API, and this is how it's working. So what's new? Because basically there's tons of features already in the existing version, but if we look at version 5, let's see what's new then. So first thing, there's now more use of scalars. Scalars are like base types. So in cases where Guillotine 4 used string, we now, in many places, we use JSON instead, meaning that you don't have to parse it when you're going to use it on the client. You can just access it as JSON. There's the date scalar and local time, which basically simplifies developers' lives again. We have now also enabled use of filters. These have always been in the core API, but now it's also available from the Headless API. So the filters are currently this: exists, not exist, has value, etc. So you might ask, why would I use filters if I have queries? Short version is that filters are faster and they don't affect the ranking score of the hits. So it might be useful in selected cases. Also, you can use a DSL description of this rather than writing like a query string. So that might also have some benefits. We have also exposed the aggregations. So now you can take full advantage of the powerful search capabilities of XP. So you get term aggregations, range, stats, geodistance, etc. So these are awesome if you're going to do some nice sort of search navigation interfaces or present stats for your data. Another thing that's been sort of eagerly requested is how images are handled inside the rich text field, the HTML area. So we have refactored the response from the HTML area. So you now get the rich text type instead, and there's several fields there, and one of them is called processed HTML, which contains kind of a manipulated result. And for the images specifically, it will still contain a default image element that you can use out of the box with the default kind of sizing. The big difference is that this element will now also contain a reference to a payload that you can also access. So it means you can get all the data about that image separately, which is super useful if you're, let's say you're in a React front end. You can then say, okay, here's the basic markup, and then you can replace the images with your own code based on this payload. Then there's also another nice little feature, which is automatic generations of source set. If you don't want to go all the way with replacing, you can simply pass in some parameters to the processing. So say you want sizes 200, 300, and 500 to be generated. You simply pass those values in, and you'll get then a source set attribute for your image, which basically means that the browsers will be able to download the optimal size of that image. You're no longer locked into the default one. Also, an important detail: this is currently only available via Guillotine, but it will also be available for backend developers with the release of XP 7.7. So you get the same functionality there with process HTML. Next, there's macro handling. That's another highly anticipated requested feature. Macros, so far in Guillotine 4, we simply pass the raw data that's in the core of XP, and kind of put a lot of load on the developers that were going to use it. What we've done is we're now treating this kind of similar to images, meaning that we replace this sort of native implementation with a simple editor macro element. That means that you can do the same handling that you do for images, because you can also get this macro raw data accessible as outside of the markup. So you basically get two things. You get the markup and you get this data for the macro outside. I'll show you the details later. We've also improved subscriptions. So basically, previously it's been, I'd say, way too open. It would return all events happening inside of XP if you didn't do anything. Now, by default, it sort of limits it to content related and minimizes it to the current branch and project. And you can also customize the event filter yourself when you set up Guillotine. And the implementation is more flexible. So it's using WebSockets, and you have more control over it yourself. All right, final slide of improvements. We have improved consistency when we generate field names. In some cases, for option sets and item set, it would use underscores or capital Ks, where it didn't do that for plain fields. So now this is all entirely consistent in how it's generated. The reason why we have to generate is because GraphQL doesn't support sort of any kind of field name, while XP supports a bigger range of characters for field for properties. We also added the attachment object directly returned from the upload field, and a new field called attachment URL, so you could easily generate those as well. And then finally, some other type cleanups have been made where it wasn't optimal, so to say. So all the details are available in the documentation, both sort of the new features and the list of the breaking changes. Obviously, with Guillotine, you can deploy both a version of the old API and the new at the same time if you like. Right, so let's go for a demo. Enough slides. Right, so we did this basic query. Let's have a look at a query. I have some examples here about filters. What does that look like? Right. So in order to use filters, you have to use the query connection field. And in this case, you can see a very simple filter here. I'm basically doing a query that says, oh, type has to be Enonic, example person, right? So the filter is then not exists date of birth. So let's see what happens. So there's only one entry where date of birth doesn't exist. So if I look at my list of content, it's this one, obviously, right? So I have I think 20-something persons here. If I just change it then to exists, yeah, so now I'm getting the rest. So this is just one way of using filters. And here you can see how when using query connection, this is the standard GraphQL pattern for pagination. So you use edges and nodes, and then I'm printing the display name and date of birth. Right? All right, let's have a look at another example. And this time it's aggregations. It's going to be a bit bigger. I can move this down. All right, so I'm doing the same query. I'm basically saying, give me all persons, and then I'm running the aggregation called my aggregation, and I'm asking for a date range based on the date of birth. So I'm creating ranges myself there, one from 1900 to 1940, 41 to 70, and then 71 to now. And then I'm printing out all the hits here still. And then I'm also doing this one, get aggregations as JSON. So if I run it, let's see what I get. You get the aggregation buckets here. One is the key, which is basically, it says from 1900 to 1940, and it's 3 hits, right? And from 40 to 70, 11 hits, and then 2. So that's how that works. And then there's the regular printing out of the hits. So a nice thing, if you just want to get the aggregation data, 1, 2, 3, like this, I think. 1, 2, 3. Oh, maybe one more. You can just play like this. So I don't get any content, I'm just returning the aggregations. So for people familiar with the content API, you'll see this is very, very similar to how that works. Right, next query. So it's getting more interesting, I guess, for some of you. It's about this, about accessing this rich text. So if we look at my data, I'll open up Brad Pitt here, edit. Yeah, so we can see Brad has some fields, and he has this document field, and Brad goes to Hollywood, right? And just save it. We go back to the Guillotine. We can see the result here is basically, I'm accessing two values. I'm accessing processed HTML and raw. So you can see I'm getting processed HTML, which is the string, and then the raw, which is, they're basically the same, right? So let's move on and try to play around with images. So what I'll do, I'll go to Brad and I'll add an image. Let's see. Puma. All right. And yeah. Change the resolution a bit. So I can use my styles. So you could say, for instance, the Super Mario Classic mode style. Perfect. Insert and save. So by playing now, we can see that obviously we're getting more markup. And if I look through this one, we can see that they're still kind of similar. But if you look at the actual source here, this field, alt src, you can see this contains a real URL, that this is actually a real image. I could use this link, but then in the raw case, we're going to get stuff like image and the ID of the image and some parameters. So so there's obviously some differences already. And I'm going to copy out the new query. Sorry. So this time I'm going to do two things. I'm instructing the API to generate 3 different sizes in the source set. And I'm also fetching, you can see this one. It's basically going in and say, okay, I want to get the information about the images. I want to get the style details, and I want to get the display name of the actual image and the reference, in this case. Play. And this time I remove the raw. So we can now see we're getting a lot of more markup here. So probably somewhere inside there you can see the source set. Yeah, here you can see 200W. So here you see source set. So it's actually then generating the 200 and 500 and 1000 sizes. Also, I'm getting information about the image. So we can see that I'm actually fetching the title of the image here and the style that was selected by the editor. And this is optional for you to use. It's basically saying that by default, this is what's configured on the server. But this is interesting. So there's the reference. So if I scroll up, I should be able to find the reference image, alt src, data image reference. So basically, the element has the reference, means you can find it and replace it and manipulate it in your front-end framework. All right, so that's images. Moving on to macros. It's kind of the same approach. Play. As you can see, I don't have any macros yet, right? So I just have the regular stuff. Let's go into Brad again and just add, I'll just remove the image to keep it simple. And insert a macro. I'll just do the note panel. Okay. I would testing body and insert, and there you can also do basic markup stuff. Save. So I now have a macro. I run again, and we can see that we now get this nice editor macro. The name is note, so it's a note macro, and it has a reference. And here's actually the body still left inside the HTML, and here is the macro data. So here I'm getting, this is one of the things that we're going to fix before we release, but here's basically the data. So you can use that to replace it. I just have one final thing I'm going to show you before we wrap up the slides. So it's basically about subscriptions. So if you haven't tried this before, you can then, refresh, I think. Yeah. You can then start subscription and listen to events based on stuff happening on the platform. So if I run play, you can see it's now listening here. And if I make a change to the document, you can see we got an event saying this node was updated. It's always useful to get this kind of information. So that concludes the demo, and I just have a couple of small slides. So this week, we're just doing some final wrap-ups and going to release 5.0 within the end of the week. And then I have two small more things. I want to mention something coming really soon, libstatic. You can now, with libstatic, you can easily deploy your static resources together with your app and get absolute control over things like caching. So if you're generating static assets via Webpack, etc., you can get this kind of absolute control over caching and reuse and updates. So that's going to go live very soon as well. And for Headless, our next mission is to embed the default preview in XP. So regardless of content type or anything, you'll be able to see those data in some kind of neutral way. That's it for me. I got 2 minutes overtime, I see, but I hope it was worth it.
Absolutely. We have one question from Maxim. Is it possible to call GraphQL inside XP controller without making a request to API, basically using Guillotine instead of content-lib.query?
Yeah, you can actually do that. Please post on the forum, and I'm sure we'll give you some examples on how to do that. So you don't have to go via HTTP, basically. You can do it internally.
Yeah, so that was the only question we had. I guess some people are wondering when, but you answered that. We are wrapping up last fixes, and it's hopefully will be released this week. Yeah, thank you, Thomas. As the presentation title says, being headless never felt so good. So also nice insights into what's coming.